All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Maritza and I are holding down the fort tonight. We will be your facilitators as we are going through chapter 3 of Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience by Csikszentmihalyi. Just a little housekeeping so everybody knows we have a hard stop at 8:55 today because directly following this meeting, there is another 52 Living Ideas meetup on the Ascent of Man, but it will be at a different Zoom link. So we'll make sure to give that to you, and definitely going to want to join in as we go through Jacob Bronowski's classic documentary. This is one of my favorites actually in the Jacob Bronowski series, The Grain in the Stone. But first, right now, we get to go through chapter 3 of Flow. And this is, I believe, one of the most important chapters in the whole book because we're finally going to go through all of the elements that MC identifies as the characteristics of the flow experience. So this is really where we get to go in and get a really clear picture about what flow is all about. But first, we're going to do a presentation. Maritza prepared, although right now we're just looking at her computer screen, Maritza. We're not seeing the presentation. We're seeing your meetup screen right now. You did see the presentation. Like I don't know what happened there. You had it up there.
Let me try again.
And then it went to your meetup screen.
That's no good. All right, I will try again. Give me a second.
No worries. So just so everyone knows, we're going to do this presentation because this group, it's definitely open if you've read the chapter. If you haven't read the chapter, here we are. So just so that everybody is on the same page, then we'll open it up for questions and comments from people who are reading along with us, people who have read the chapter, want to say something. We're going to go into breakout rooms and then into a round of lightning questions, and that should hopefully take us all the way through 8:55. All right, why don't we get started then with the slideshow experience. So first, just a quick introduction. If this is your first time joining us, we just had a couple bullet points if you want to read through and see what we talked about in the introduction, the first chapters here, just to give you a sense of what this book is going to be all about. I just want to read one of the quotes I really like here on this slide is where MC tells us that happiness, in fact, is a condition that must be prepared for, cultivated and defended privately by each person. People who learn to control inner experience will be able to determine the quality of their lives, which is as close as any of us can come to being happy. And in the chapter we're going to explore today, he makes this distinction between pleasure and enjoyment. And I'll just say personally, as someone who's really invested in thinking about language and language issues, it's clearly not a common use of these terms, but I think he does give us a really interesting concept, a way to think about first the kind of pleasure that is immediate and instantaneous and in the moment versus a kind of enjoyment that actually is difficult, requires work, but leads to happiness in the end. And this is where we're really going to get into what a flow state is all about. And that's what our whole chapter here is going to be all about. Did you want to say anything about this introductory slide, Maritza?
Nope, I'm going to hold off and we're just going to go through these fairly quickly. What I will do though for you guys is I'll throw the PowerPoint into the chat for you if any of you want to pick it up.
Cool. You want to take us to the next slide then? So this is then just a quick recap of what we did last week. It's been a couple of weeks since everyone was here, and for everyone who wasn't here, in the last chapter, we had an in-depth exploration into consciousness and what consciousness is all about. For example, one of the things that we learn about here is that the mark of a person who is in control of consciousness is the ability to focus attention at will, to be oblivious to distractions, to concentrate for as long as it takes to achieve a goal and not longer. And the person who can do this usually enjoys the normal course of everyday life. So for those who were here last week, you might remember we spent a lot of time talking about focus and attention, how focus and attention shapes the self, and then how that self then might, in a spiral way, shape what it is that you focus on. And this now, I think, sets us up for going to that specific aspect of consciousness, which is our consciousness of pleasure and happiness and enjoyment, which is what we're getting to in this chapter. So here we are now, chapter 3, our big chapter for the week. This chapter is called Enjoyment and the Quality of Life. So just a quick quote to get us started. MC tells us, instead of worrying about how to make $1 million or how to influence people, it seems more beneficial to find out how everyday life can be made more harmonious and more satisfying, and thus achieve by a direct route what cannot be reached through the pursuit of symbolic goals. And that's what we're going to do in this chapter. He's going to give us the 8 elements of the flow experience. And it is through paying attention to these elements and trying to have more of them in our everyday life that we can improve the quality of our everyday experiences and ideally, hopefully, bring more enjoyment into our everyday experiences. We learn here that in our culture, wealth, power, and status have become powerful symbols of happiness, but so many of those who achieve these status symbols are still miserable. While these symbolic goals can be useful and helpful, they should not be taken as the answer to our unhappy lives. MC talks about the methods we can integrate into our daily work life to achieve our preset goals. One is to make external conditions match our goals, while the second is to experience external conditions so that they fit our goals. Neither of these strategies is effective when used alone. To improve life, one must improve the quality of experience. I'll say one thing I found really interesting at the beginning of this chapter was he talks about how we have broadly these 2 different kinds of strategies to become happy. We can either pay attention to what's going on out there in the world around us and do things to change what's happening in the world around us to make ourselves happier, or we can bring attention to what's going on inside ourselves and try to make changes inside ourselves in order to improve the quality of our experience. It struck me that it seems like this is almost the classic West versus East, if you want to put it broadly that way, how these 2 cultures, broadly speaking, have tried to solve this problem. But I love how MC emphasizes that we need both of these strategies. We need essentially a wide-ranging global approach. Perhaps could look at it that way. We need to look at traditions from both the East and the West. We have to become masters at both controlling our inner experience and also controlling our outer experience. And when we can have that range of tools, that's what's going to help us live better lives every day. Maritza, do you want to jump in and share some of your thoughts about the start here?
Sure. To me here, this the last line, it seems very small and very, simple. To improve life, one must improve the quality of experience. And yet, I feel even if you've never picked up this book and you have no idea what flow is, that statement gives you a path towards finding flow, even if you're not aware that what you want to find is flow. Because if we talk about what do we ultimately want? All of us want a better life, right? We do want, it says to improve life. And if you reverse it and you ask yourself this question, do you want to improve life? Very few people that I know would answer no to that question. So if it's possible to do so by improving the quality of experience, then how do we do that? And that there is the key to the setup for the rest of this chapter. MC is telling us, okay, this is the bar, and now I'm going to help provide you with tools on how to get there. And I think that's the keep in your mind that the goal here is experience, and then we'll move forward with that.
Well said. Ready for the next slide? So next, we start this chapter before we get to the 8 different elements of the flow state by this discussion of pleasure and enjoyment. And again, we have this great quote: to gain personal control over the quality of experience, one needs to learn how to build enjoyment into what happens day in and day out. So to expand upon what it might mean to learn how to build enjoyment into daily life, MC gives us this distinction between pleasure and enjoyment. He tells us experience can give you 2 things, pleasure and enjoyment. The pursuit of pleasure is an important element of quality of life, like eating, sleeping, and resting. Pleasure helps to maintain order. However, it cannot create a new order in our consciousness by itself. Pleasure feels good, but it's not rewarding. Enjoyment, on the other hand, is a different sensation. People naturally get huge enjoyment from growing and developing. Enjoyment is characterized by forward movement, by a sense of novelty, of accomplishment. So, as I said, I think there is perhaps a quibble here about the language. Certainly, this is not the way that these words, pleasure and enjoyment, are typically used, I think, in the English language. But I think the distinction that MC is pointing us toward here is a really important one to grasp. And I see him telling us that we really ideally want both of these things in our life. We want pleasure, which comes from immediate experiences, sensory, the immediate emotional experiences of feeling good, feeling happy, feeling pleasurable. And we also want enjoyment, which comes from facing challenges, from doing things that are difficult, but by pursuing these things that in the moment may not feel so good, may not feel so pleasurable. By pursuing these challenges, these are the experiences that allow us to grow. As MC will put it, it brings more order to the self every time we gain a new skill and level up our abilities and learn more and become better versions of ourselves. He phrases this as we're bringing more order to our consciousness. We are growing the self, and that we want both of these experiences. And flow is really going to get into this second aspect. It's going to get into the enjoyment aspect of what it is to have this quality of life.
Yes, and I think I agree entirely. And one thing I do want to add on here is to point out to you that between the words pleasure and enjoyment is the word and. It's not versus and it's not or. So I agree entirely with what Joya said, is that we're not negating that both of these elements have some value. We're just saying that if we're looking to gain control over flow in any way, shape, or form, the path towards that is going to lie more within enjoyment than pleasure. And it's okay, because MC is going to explain to you why.
Yeah. And one more interesting thing to add here is I think many times when people, in a conventional sense, talk about happiness, they're often sometimes just focusing on the pleasure aspect. They're just focusing on what you might call a hedonistic approach to having happiness in life. And I think what's really powerful about this book is that MC is literally going to give us the recipe for enjoyment. He's literally going to tell us what are the different elements that we can bring into our lives so that we can have this more difficult kind of happiness, but one that is ultimately deeper, more meaningful, and more lasting than just the momentary pleasures, so that we can have all of this range of happiness in our life. So we can have the momentary pleasures and the really deep, difficult enjoyment. So I think that is going to take us then to our next slide, right, Maritza?
Yes, I'm gonna two more things off of your comment is you guys, some of you have heard me say it before. I'm gonna say it again. I in general don't subscribe to the notion of seeking happiness. So I will be the more stoically inclined of those of us here. I think that, if you do so many of the aspects and things that we're gonna see here, you're gonna find that you're not actually trying to, your target is not happiness. it's going to be, I've said it before, I think it should be a happy byproduct of, goal searching and finding that meaningful path. And so, maybe that's just words. And, but I do see that the way it's going to be, you'll see it spelled out for you throughout this chapter specifically. It actually agrees with that. He's not pointing you directly towards happiness. He's helping you frame, maybe build a road.
I love that phrase. You said before, even this phrase of building the path forward to finding flow. I think that's even just a great phrase for what it is we're trying to do. And for everybody on the call who is familiar with Stoicism, I think it's going to be really great the kinds of integrations we'll be able to make when we do the, syntopically looking at flow and Stoicism and seeing how they compare. So let's then dive into the 8 different elements. So, and one of the most fascinating things about these 8 elements that really came out of MC's work, and I think this is really what has made him a legend in the field, you could say, and really is the basis of this whole flow book, was that he recognized that these elements of flow were universal. He did this research talking with people literally of all different ages, races, religions, socioeconomic classes, people literally all over the planet, different fields of endeavor, different careers, different passions, people as different as you could possibly imagine. And yet, universally, there were these same recurring themes that came up over and over again. So we really had this picture of a view of flow that applies across the board universally. So perhaps not every single individual, but something that definitely transcends time and space and cultures. And that's what we're going to start exploring here. And the first element of flow that we're going to talk about is often in shorthand referred to as the challenge skills balance. And it's reflected here in the graph that Maritza provided for us. And as it says here, that what this first element requires is a challenging activity that requires skills. The difficulty of a task has to provide the right degree of challenge to a person's ability. A too difficult piece of music will leave a musician frustrated and disappointed. A too easy one leads to boredom and routine. So flow occurs in the range between too much and too little. I always like to think of this channel as the Goldilocks channel, because it is that just right sweet spot between, on the one hand, anxiety, frustration, fear of failure, and on the other hand, boredom, routine, loss of interest. And what I think is even fascinating, and this graph already starts to capture, is that there is this upward motion, ideally, to flow, that as human beings, we have this ability to learn, to grow, to develop new skills. And as we're developing new skills, we're seeking out greater and greater challenges. And this is one way in which you could almost say by riding the flow channel, we're consistently growing ourselves. Because let's say, to give an example, let's say we are this musician and you've never played a note before in your life, that the first time you try to pick up the instrument, that's going to be an incredible challenge. But what will happen? You'll start to practice, and then those first few notes are going to be too easy. So now that's not going to get you into the flow state. So you're going to have to increase your skills more, try to find that sweet spot where it's challenging, but not too easy. And so you're going to have to continually keep up leveling your skills in order to keep riding that Goldilocks channel, that sweet spot of the challenge skills balance. Did you want to add anything to that, Maritza?
I don't think I can. That was perfectly stated. We're just going to move on.
So the next elements of flow, you'll see Maritza and I even started to organize these into pairs, because as we were going through it, it seemed to us that several of these really even start to go together. So we're going to discuss all of these as pairs. So the first pair we wanted to discuss was this idea of having both clear goals and immediate feedback. That when you have these two elements, clear goals and immediate feedback, these are elements that can help get you into that flow state. So in terms of clear goals, we want tasks that are goal-directed and clear. It says here, allow for the best possibility of achieving flow. A trivial goal will not produce flow. So this connects it again to this idea of challenge. So we want a goal that is clear and challenging enough. And then simultaneously, we want immediate feedback. We need various bits of information that provide a symbolic message about our goal. Any kind of feedback is enjoyable if it is logically related to a goal in which one has invested psychic energy. So again, and I think probably for people in this group, can even maybe start making some interesting connections with the concept of the OODA loop, and what that is to have goals and feedback and how that helps us progress. And what we're learning here, I believe from MC, is that this is critical for how we grow ourselves in complexity and how we achieve this deep level of enjoyment in life.
Right. I will say when we start getting into these, so for the first one, to me, I felt like it was like kind of obvious, right? And it made perfect sense to me. You know, more greater challenge, that sweet spot between challenge and skill set to me was kind of a no-brainer. When we slide into these are slightly touching more on the emotional side to me than the intellectual. Not to say it's negating the intellectual, but it's kind of one of those things of, if one turns it inward and asks oneself, are my goals clear? Do I get immediate feedback? It's kind of shocking to realize that for some of your goals, you've never actually considered that. And so this is here where I think that it's useful to just be reminded that these are very important elements. And even though they seem kind of obvious, because they do seem obvious, they can easily be forgotten, especially the feedback, the concept of feedback. I think that we live in a society that is ever increasingly thin-skinned. So, you know, the question on how we would get feedback for some of us may seem a daunting task, but it's good to remember that when we're talking about feedback, I love the way it's stated, various bits of information, right? Because you're not necessarily looking for somebody to tell you that you're just on this amazing path. You're looking for little things, like if you have a goal and you know, say the goal is a 6-month plan, if you get one aspect of it, if you look at it from a very clinical perspective, you're like, well, it's only 5% out of 100. But if you look at it from a perspective of, I needed 100 pieces and I wasn't sure that I could get it, but now I have one piece. Is it easier now that I only have 99? Oh, wait, what does this one piece give me? It's a jumping off point to get to the next piece. And that's what having a feedback brings. And it doesn't need to be a verbal kind of feedback. It can be any small clue or something that you see, because it's a sense, right? So if we're our the ultimate goal is flow. So what is going to put you on that path? It's like, you know, with Goldilocks, as Joya mentioned, her feedback, instant feedback, was too hot, too cold, right? So those are the types of things you're looking for. They can be external or internal, but I think in general, they're probably going to be more internal things, I would imagine. All right, Joya.
I think that's perfectly said. And I don't know, my stream doesn't seem to be working. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear me,
but
Marissa?
yes, but you're freezing up a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know why my computer's not working. I'm going to try to maybe close some of these things down. So I'll just quickly talk about the next elements here. So the next pairing that we have is loss of self-consciousness
Nope,
and
Joya,
the transformation of time. These are interesting to me because, so in times.
Joya, you're cutting out.
Okay, you want to take the next two?
I will, yeah. Try and see if, because we're not hearing you. Half of what you're saying is going off. All right, folks, man, I've got what is it? The baton? I don't know how to say it. Sorry. Okay, so we're going into the loss of self-consciousness and the transformation of time. So we're looking at the loss of self-consciousness. The way we're describing it here for you is concern for the self disappears, yet paradoxically, the sense of self emerges stronger after the flow experience is over. And then for the transformation of time, it's the sense of the duration of time is altered. Hours pass by in minutes, and minutes can stretch out to seem like ours. What these two are saying to us is this idea of everything else fades away. When you hit that sweet spot, you'll know it later. You won't know it when you're in that sweet spot, because when you're in that sweet spot, that's all that exists. You don't have time to wonder about any of your personal, demons or angels or insecurities. All of that is going to fade away. You don't have you just don't have time for that. Or not time, you don't have enough bandwidth is what happens. When you hit that flow state, whatever you're doing becomes the only thing you can perceive, the only thing you can see. I really like the way here that, sorry, and I wasn't quite ready to chat yet. But so MC tells us that in flow, there's no room for self-scrutiny. So because enjoyable activities have clear goals, stable rules, and challenges well matched to skills, there is little opportunity for the self to be threatened. And I think that that's a really important thing. Almost more so is that we also are told that, the loss of a sense of self is it's the loss of the sense of self separate from the world around it. And this is, for us, it's a case of everything falls away, right? So if you find yourself worrying about, day-to-day trivialities, well, then now you've bumped yourself out of flow. And it's like a oneness or a single pointedness of mind is what that would be the goal, right? But it's like, so something else that I think is important here is and I'm focusing on the loss of self-consciousness, because I feel like the transformation of time, that's a really simple one to grasp. And all of us are like, oh yeah, time flies when you're having fun, right? We all have heard that statement. So that's kind of encapsulated in the transformation of time. But this loss of self-consciousness is the one that, for me, I kind of had to sit and mull over for a while. Because MC also tells us that, we should really be aware that the loss of self-consciousness does not involve a loss of self, and certainly not a loss of consciousness. It's only a loss of consciousness of the self. Have I lost you guys? You still following me? So loss of self-consciousness, a loss of consciousness of the self, but not a loss of the self and not a loss of the consciousness. That's really important, because you're still a conscious being, because if you're not conscious, you're probably asleep or, fainted or something else. And you're never going to lose your actual self. It's not going to get lost, but you're going to lose the consciousness of yourself, which I think is fascinating, because while I've never before really pondered it, if you think back on those moments when you were just in the flow, if you're a runner and you're running, and after mile 10, well, if you're a real runner, 10 miles is probably nothing, but if you're me, a mile, and it's really hard. Actually, I have been in that place where a mile or 2 miles was my limit. And when you get to the end and you're like, oh, I can't make it, but then you round the corner and you see the end and you're like, wait a minute, I can make that. And you just start sprinting for all you're worth. There is nothing on your mind, nothing, except I can make it there just a little further, right? And everything fades away. The fact that you probably look a sweaty mess and, you're slow compared to the person running next to you, or there's a car passing by that's probably going to mock you. None of that enters into your consciousness, because there's no room. Only thing you have room for is that marker up ahead that tells you you made it the distance you were going to make. And that's what they mean by a loss of sense of self. You can't be insecure. You can't scrutinize all those things that we spend 90% of the rest of our time doing, because there's no room, because you are so focused that everything else just falls away. And that includes the self. The most fascinating aspect of that, though, is that when you are done with the flow state and your sense of self becomes aware to you again, it's not the same self. And isn't that interesting? It's so somehow in the time from when you were halfway through that run and you finished that run, your self changed. You emerged a different self, even if minutely, because it grew, it changed for the better. But you can't know that, perceive it, or even ponder it until after. All right, so I've spent way too much time on there.
No, can you hear me? Like, I don't know why my computer just died. But
Oh,
at
no.
least I think it made you the host though. So I think you're now officially the host.
Let me host you. Let me add you as co-host again if I can.
Okay.
I don't know, but if not, go ahead and go on to the others, and I'll do the behind the scenes admin stuff.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say something really quick, even about the idea of loss of consciousness and transformation of time, which I was starting to say before I got cut off. This one is really fascinating to me from the research that has come even since MC wrote this book way back in 1990. So since that time, there's been a lot of really interesting research, I think, from people who've been interested in the neuroscience of what's going on in a flow state. And one of the things that these researchers have identified, they call it transient hypofrontality, which is a fancy way of saying for a short time, which is transient. Hypo, meaning the opposite of hyper, meaning less, and hypofrontality, meaning frontal, your frontal cortex. There's this idea that your frontal cortex, in this transient momentary way, minimizes its activity. And that seems to be related to both of these aspects of why you lose your sense of self-consciousness and also your ability to process time. Usually that kind of activity is processed in our frontal cortex. So that to me was always just something really interesting that perhaps suggests why these elements come when you are in a flow state. But let's get on even to the ones here about the merging of action and awareness and concentration on the task at hand. To me, this is even indicative of what the flow state is all about. It's how you know you're in a flow state is because you're having that experience of being so absorbed in whatever the task is that's all that you can process. That's all you're aware of is whatever it is that's going on right then in the moment. And it comes with that feeling of how it feels like the task and yourself just merge into one. I love how Marissa was describing it as this is the feelings of what it is to be in the flow state. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add there then, Marissa, or should we go on to the
I feel like, interestingly enough, I feel like the pair of the loss of self-consciousness and the transformation of time, they really go very much hand in hand with this merging of action and awareness and the concentration on the task at hand, because it's all leading you to the same point that everything else falls away. When you find yourself in that sweet spot, that's the only thing you can possibly see.
So the last element of the 8 here to talk about is this idea of the paradox of control. And this one I think even takes us into how this chapter ends up, which is going to be a description all about the Autotelic experience. And I have to say, Marissa and I were even talking about this earlier, and this is one way in which this chapter, the way he organized this baffles me a little bit, because when I read this chapter, I see that the heart of this chapter is all about these 8 elements. That's really what our focus is going to be about. And our next chapter, chapter 4, is really going to get into this idea of the Autotelic experience. So I don't know if this is his way of just trying to give us a little bit of a teaser. And so maybe this is your teaser to hopefully come join us in 2 weeks' time, where we're going to go into more depth about what he he means by this idea of autotelic experience. That's really what chapter 4 is all about. But just to get us into there, and because it is how he rounds up this chapter, first we have the idea of this last element when we're talking about flow, which is the idea of the paradox of control. So he says here, enjoyable experiences allow people to exercise a sense of control over their actions. And to me, it's fascinating that it is this paradox, because on the one hand, given the feeling of what it is to be in a flow state, on the one hand, there is this sense of a lack of control, but yet the way it feels is that you have this sense of control. So the paradox there, I believe, really is in the feeling that you have this sense of control, even when you're really operating at what really is probably the upper limit edge of your abilities, when you're in that channel of the challenge skills balance. And then just lastly, to give you the little sneak preview here about autotelic experience, MC tells us, he's going to inform us that an autotelic experience is one that is self-contained and is not engaged with out of expectation of future reward, but simply because the doing in and of itself is reward enough. An essential aspect of optimal experience, and perhaps the most significant one, is the engagement in the act for its own sake. Optimal experience is an end in itself. And then this final quote, the flow experience, like everything else, is not good in an absolute sense. It is good only in that it has the potential to make life more rich, intense, and meaningful. It is good because it increases the strength and complexity of the self. And I have to say, I do feel he really leaves us with this big cliffhanger here at the end of this chapter, because he's going to give us this idea that a flow state is an end in itself. It's something that we pursue because it feels good to do. We would do it for no other external reason, but for that intrinsic motivation of the enjoyment that we get from it. But then he's going to point out to us that several instances of things that are flow states are things that we would objectively identify as being bad, if not downright evil. For example, people that have flow experiences when they're in war, that's definitely a kind of circumstance where all of these things come to play, where you're totally absorbed in the moment, where you're in that challenge skills balance. It's definitely a flow state. Also, lots of criminal activities, he points out to us, often happen in a flow state, which means that the flow state itself is not necessarily something that we would morally, I believe, identify as a good, that there's an ethical component that's separate from flow itself. But then he really just gives us that teaser into this really big topic that we don't really, I believe, cover in full depth here yet.
Right, that's very true. The concept of flow being a neutral element is, I think it's a fascinating one. We touched upon it a little bit last week. I think that it will see elements of it, probably, I would expect, in every chapter, which is why I chose this quote, because I thought it was a really great last quote. And then we're hoping we're going to use this quote when we go into our chat rooms. But first, I want to chat a little bit with you about the paradox of control. Something that is really important here to point out is that MC tells us that what people enjoy is not the sense of being in control, but the sense of exercising control in difficult situations. He says it is not possible to experience a feeling of control unless one is willing to give up the safety of protective routines. Only when a doubtful outcome is at stake and one is able to influence that outcome can a person really know whether he or she is in control. And that's kind of almost exactly what Joya was just saying, just in a slightly different way. It's this thing of, you are not literally in control. The challenge for you, that moving forward aspect, it's not about being in control. It's about exercising control. So you are wielding these things and you are shaping, let's use the word destiny. I will say that it's not the best word, but for lack of a better one right now, right? you are shaping that path. You are molding it. And isn't that far more enticing than being like Dorothy, who's on the yellow brick road and she has no idea where it's going? That's what he's saying to us here. What we want to be building that yellow road. Now we're not going to manifest the bricks ourselves. So it's not like you can control whether or not that happens, but you can shape it. And that's and the reason it's called the paradox, at least by my understanding, is that because it seems like what you're doing is trying to be in control, but you're actually not. You're trying to exercise the control. So I just thought that was a really important thing for us to all kind of think about in the paradox of control, because it's a key element. And some of us, if we struggle in our day-to-day with control questions or problems or concerns, it's a nice but very fine point that's being made here. And for the Autotelic Experience, actually, I think that, yeah, we're gonna get so much more into that in the next upcoming chapters, that I am going to leave you guys with the gems that Joya has already given us on that.
So next, we're going to turn this discussion over to all of you, especially all of you who read the chapter. And then, Moritz, I know we're having technical difficulties. Apparently, do you see the breakout rooms on the bottom of your bar there?
Now? I do. Yep.
Okay, so then we're gonna open it up to anybody who's read the chapter at this point. If there's anything else that Moritz and I didn't say that you definitely want to make sure that we mention and put on the table. And then after that, we're gonna go into our breakout rooms. But if anybody would like to say something here, you can either raise your hand or just type exclamation point in the chat as well, and we can call on you to come to the floor. All right, it looks like Judith first, and then Sharon. Judith?
So have Felicia after Judith, and then Sharon.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, you can't see the raised hands. I'll type them for you.
Okay.
Thank you. So I guess I just wanted to fine point something that Maritza, an example Maritza gave of the running and being in flow when you're trying to reach that goal, because that felt to me like not flow, because then you have a goal. Is it flow? It would seem to me when you're running, it's more like you're just that action of foot after, step after step after step, without a goal per se. When you're like in, maybe, halfway there, and you're just like, I can do this, or you realize, okay, now it just seems to be happening, but not at that last minute. But that's just me. But maybe you can, tell me how I'm seeing it. Maybe wrong.
I think that's a really interesting, valid point. One of the questions here that I don't think MC really gets into in detail is, do you need all of these elements to get into the flow state? And my sense is that the answer is no, that it would seem to me that most flow states have most of these things, but not necessarily. So for the running example, it would seem to me that even sometimes the phrase runner's high is often seen as equivalent to being in the flow state. But I believe when that happens, it's because you're at that point where you're in that sweet spot of the challenge skills balance, that you are totally absorbed in the moment. You probably are getting immediate feedback, even if it's at a more of a subconscious level of what it is to, as you're running and having the experience of running. But I would say that you're right, that you perhaps don't necessarily have clear goals there, maybe beyond just the fact of keep running is the clear goal. Did you want to say anything more to that, Maritza?
Yes, sorry, forgot I was muted. To address, the runner comment I made, what I was hoping you would focus on is the fact that all your aches and pains, all your self-conscious moments fade away, because you've now set your sight on the end goal, because now you can suddenly see it. And it's like, you know, you're feeling super tired. You don't know if you're going to make it. You're feeling self-conscious. And then you turn the corner and you see the goal. It's not that you're focusing on the goal, but seeing that mile marker that tells you you're done, it just does something. And it puts you in this state where the only thought you have is to make it there. That was the example I was trying to give. I don't know, maybe it wasn't the best example, but it was kind of just to show you that all your other cares will fade away and they become non-issues. And it's not because, okay, I'm good, she got it. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. So, and I think we answered Felicia's question here too. So we're gonna then do Sharon, Jack, I think Dave also raised his hand, and then we'll go do the breakout room. So Sharon next. Sharon, you're still on mute here, sorry. Why don't we go to Jack, and then Sharon, get unmuted. You can come in next. Jack, you want to go next?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. You gave me a lot of things to write down as notes that I didn't already have while reading through the chapter. So the first time we met, we'd gone into breakout rooms, and I forget who it was now, had mentioned his experience with flow in the workplace and how, you know, he kind of experienced a negative aspect of it where, you know, it became almost like an addictive property. And at the time, you know, when I first heard this, and I hadn't read through the book yet or really gotten deep into this topic, I kind of like didn't associate the two. You know, I said that at the time, I think I said something along the lines of, well, that's more, isn't that more work, being a workaholic, or the idea of workaholism as opposed to flow, which is, you know, something that is like what we said before, a neutral state and all these various different properties as it relates to enjoyment of the experience. And then on page 61, he mentioned, wait, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, on page 61, he says, this sense of being, so this is in relation to the paradox of control. This sense of being in a world where entropy is suspended explains in part why flow-producing activities can become so addictive. So I found that really interesting, and it makes sense. I mean, he gives examples of like escapism and playing chess, and how somebody had come up with, it got really bad. Like somebody had gotten, you know, got so focused on developing a chess strategy and then try to apply the concepts in real life and ended up throwing himself out of a window. So yeah, there was that. And then also on page 69, so this relates to the Autotelic Experience. He says, but as we have already seen in the section dealing with the sense of control, one must be aware of the potential addictive power of flow. We should reconcile ourselves to the fact that nothing in the world is entirely positive. Every power can be misused. So yeah, it's gotten me, you know, a new perspective on, you know, the impact of flow and the potential addictive properties of it.
Oh, thank you for that. And bringing that up, that wasn't something that we get discussed, but I think you're right. That is a really important thing to focus on here, that flow does have this potential to be addictive. It's not all necessarily perfectly positive. You want to pursue flow, but you don't want to get addicted. And I'll just add here too, that this is even one of the interesting things that's now coming out of the neuroscience research, that the scientists are making connections between the neurotransmitter chemicals that get released when we're in a flow state. And it turns out that a flow state seems to be correlated with dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, essentially all of the feel-good chemicals that we know are addictive for humans. So there is a way in which playing with flow can be like playing with fire, in a sense, if you're not careful to pay attention to the potentially addictive aspect to it. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's definitely something we're going to want to keep in mind as we go through this discussion. We want to pursue flow, but we don't want to become addicts, for sure.
Right. And I do want to say that I really do appreciate that MC is very careful to make sure to tell us that, you know, it's not a either or scenario. It can be both. And I love the idea that we should be ever present or not ever present, we should be ever conscious of the fact that flow is neutral. It can, how you use it is how it ends up being. And he tells us, he says, it is an illusion to believe that any solution is beneficial for all people and all times. Mm-hmm. And if we remember that going forward, then we won't get stuck too hard in one place.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Sharon is next.
Great, thanks. Sorry, my computer froze up last time. So I first have a question, and you had mentioned that something happens in the brain physiologically that causes, it's not really it sounded like a change in consciousness. I think it was point number 7. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about that. And then I was noticing in my notes, something I found pretty interesting was he talked about you could create flow in those situations that are annoying or just considered a waste of your time, like sitting in the dentist's office. I think he said they can become enjoyable by restructuring it, providing goals, rules, and the other elements of enjoyment. And I kind of likened that back somewhere in the chapter. He talked about that gentleman who was sitting in these boring conferences, and he created this tapping with his fingers and had 888 or some astronomical amount of different kinds of variations, and that really helped him create flow in a situation that was boring. So I thought that was interesting too.
Thanks for sharing. That was so impressive to me as well. Every time I read that, I kept thinking that really applies to our current age when we're all doing these Zoom meetings. We all probably need this tapping skill, perhaps, and hopefully not this meeting, but I'm sure we've all been on Zoom meetings where that probably would be a good skill to have. And for your first question, I'm going to put this word in the chat, transient hypofrontality, so you can Google it and find out more. But you're exactly right. It's essentially even something that happens with the brain, which then obviously produces an effect of consciousness where the activity in the frontal cortex is minimized, and that this is the center of the brain that's responsible for things like our consciousness of ourself and our consciousness of time passing, so that when there is this minimization of activity there, it's why we have this experience of loss of self-consciousness and this experience that time either seems to go by really fast or go by really slow. Yeah, I'll put that in the chat for everyone. We can go to Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Joy and Maritza, for leading us through this journey. I'm enjoying the book so far. The thing that stood out to me is it's a combination of your attitude and the activity. Several times you mentioned climbing a rock wall, but nothing's magical. Just climbing a rock wall doesn't mean it's going to be a flow experience, but it's, as I said, the combination of your attitude and the activity. Would you like to comment on that?
Maritza, do you want to go first, or?
No, I was just saying you were muted. I wasn't sure if you were trying to talk. I can go first, sure. I think that it is, so the thing is, that's what we're kind of putting under a microscope here together. We're looking at the concept of, and you're right, it's an attitude thing, we are looking to take control. We are looking to manifest ways to be on that path, the path, the meaningful, right? If I like to look at it as the meaningful path, towards a meaningful life. So if you don't want to just be wandering around in the forest and hope that you magically find the road with no compass, no nothing, no way of knowing how to reference anything, what we're looking at here is the ways in which to make it something that helps you align with this path. And and you're absolutely correct that just because, like, say for example, if Joya is like a huge avid rock climber and she gets this intense flow from rock climbing, and you're like, oh, well, I'm gonna rock climb so I can get flow. And then, you do this like super hard flow thing, and all you're done at the end is you have bruises, right? And you're like, I feel gypped. What happened? It's because it's not the right mindset for you, because again, it might have been, well, I don't know, it might not have been pleasurable for you, but if the only reason for climbing that rock was because you wanted to find joy as flow, well, I mean, naturally you can't get there, because it really is, it's interesting to think that you have to put all your senses into it, but then you have to lose all your senses to it. So that's where I'm going to leave that for now.
I'm just going to add that I am definitely not that rock climber. For me to hit that challenge skills balance, have you ever seen those walls they construct to help children learn, where it's all styrofoam and you're still in the harnesses, and even if you fall, you just fall on the padding? That would be my challenge skill level at this point, but maybe someday. And then maybe someday Dave can join in with me too. So next, we're gonna go into the breakout rooms. Words, I think you should now have it on your panel. You should just be able to hit that breakout room sign and automatically assign people to 4 different rooms. I think we wanna create 4 different rooms. And the question that we came up for you guys, for you to discuss here. So we talked about these 8 different elements. We talked about the challenge skills balance. We talked about having clear goals, immediate feedback. We talked about the experience of losing self-consciousness, about time passing strangely. We talked about the sensation of action and awareness merging, the paradox of control. So of all these different elements of flow, the question we had for you was, which of these is most resonant for you in flow experiences that you've had? Maybe this is something you think you could try to add to your daily life to find more flow, or maybe it's just something that you've experienced in a flow state that you've had yourself. So Maritza, can you take it over here, try to put everyone into the groups?
Start and break.
I'm gonna try to see if I can fix what's going on here on my computer too.
Welcome back, everybody.
All right, good to see everybody again. I think I'm going to try to put my video down just so I can make sure that I have audio here with all you guys. But it is now time for the lightning round. So this is the time when you get to think about your best question from what we did today, maybe something that came out in the breakout room, or something that you thought of as we were going through our presentation today. So if you'd like to put a question on the table, again, you can type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand here. We're going to collect everyone's questions, and then we're going to try to go through as many as we can. And as I said, we do have a hard stop at 8:55, so that hopefully we can all transition to the Ascent of Man group at a different link. Maybe I'll even put the link up while I still connected here. All right, so it looks like Jyoti is first.
Thank God Joe is not here today. I can be first. Okay, my question is, it's weird. I was going to ask Jeff and then the time lapse. Okay, how am I going to frame it? Can you have feeling of flow while you are anxiously performing a challenging act? When you are anxiously consumed in a challenging activity, there's an element of anxiety there. Can you have flow at the same time?
Good question.
Oh, okay, thank you. I was like, oh, I don't know what kind of question it is.
I think that's one that probably a lot of people are thinking about, even as you're perhaps reflecting on some of your own experiences. I think that'll lead us to a good discussion. See, so anybody else want to ask a question? Michael here made a comment. I think when we frame something as important that we previously thought of as trivial, flow now becomes possible while in that activity. Thank you for the comment.
Can you phrase that maybe as a question? Because I do like the I think it's a strong statement, but it does, in my mind, it opens the question of, okay, so how do we, this concept of reframing, where does it fit with
Mhm.
flow?
That was an excellent way to reframe that question too.
Sorry.
I love
Oh,
it.
and Michael, I do apologize. If you come up with a way to make it into a question, by all means, please type like exclamation. We'd love to hear your take on it or make it a question.
Mhm.
Next up, we got Judith.
Yes.
So I would like to get a better sense of like where flow ends and begins, or in our definition, because so we have flow in the menial things we do every day, possibly, right? If we, with the right attitude and things like that. And I have seen that happen. So I gave the example once that I lower my resistance to doing taxes, and I'm actually in the process of doing them. I kind of lose sense of time, and there's a kind of a sense of pleasure that comes from it after when it's done. But he gave the example in the book of reading books is a common one. And so then I just am not sure if that's, I mean, I lose myself reading books, go to another world, really get into it. But it doesn't seem like, then where would you draw the line? Couldn't that happen in a movie? Would that be flow? So where do we draw this line of what is flow and what is not?
I'm going to say this as what is flow, what is not. And I like the way you put it too, what is the beginning and ending to flow is a way to think about that. And certainly if you can find flow doing taxes, that is definitely something that has never happened to me. So I'm going to have to get some tips from you. Anybody else want to share any questions? Otherwise, we'll get started with answering them. So let's even start then with Jyoti's question, which was about the relationship between anxiety and flow. Can you be anxious and be in a flow state? Would anybody like to share any thoughts for Jyoti's question?
So I was going to say that I think like if you're, well, if you go by the graph, like he specifically has anxiety and boredom as two opposing forces or states, and then the flow channel inside. So I guess him answering, I think that it would be, if you have anxiety from the experience, probably not. But there's anxiety and then there's excitement. So excitement, I think, would be part of the flow channel. It doesn't break you out of that state, I don't think. But yeah, in terms of like anxiety, anxious feeling, like an anxious feeling, yeah, it really comes down to like, how do you define whether it's anxiety or if it's excitement? And then somewhat related though, I had a somewhat related question is, so he gives a lot of examples of like mountain climbers and people, racing extreme kind of sports. I'm wondering if like thrown into those types of extreme, like life or death type of situations, if flow can't be attained faster, because it's, you're almost like your psychic energy is redirected from like a lot of other things and now kind of forced into that state where it's almost like a part of a self-preserving aspect, where, yeah, it's almost like you have to be in a flow state in order to survive certain situations.
Thank you, Jack. That's a great question. We're going to add that to the list. And next up, we've got more of the J's here to answer Jyoti's question. So after Jack is Jeff and Judith, and then Maritza breaks our pattern. Jeff is next.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful presentation and session. So I think of flow as something where I'm just completely immersed. That there's a kind of a focused concentration. It takes all my mind. It's where I am emotionally. I'm sure I'm there physically. It's unlikely that I'm gonna easily get distracted by anything else, either thought or even other things that happen. And so while sports and certain things in work certainly achieve that, I remember, like it was this morning, times when my children were young, and I was with them, and they got injured in some way. One fell off a bike, one fell off a horse. And my focus was so complete. And I mean, there wasn't anything else going on in my world until they were safely in the hands of somebody who could take care of them. And so I think of that as flow. But was I anxious? Absolutely, I was anxious. Part of my flow was not showing my anxiety, but the conversation I was having with myself in order to stay adequately calm, but be absolutely as smart as I could possibly be regarding what to do in every second of every moment. So I think that things that might generate anxiety or concern, at least in my experience, some of them have certainly generated what I think of as flow.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that's absolutely true, that there's definitely an element of risk and high consequences that leads us into that flow state. And certainly that experience of being immersed and absorbed in that experience is what flow is all about. Let's hear what Judith has to say about this next.
Oh, I love Jeff's example. Wonderful example, because I was just thinking, my response was going to be that it's that sweet spot where you're also exercising control. So if you're, that he talked about. So if you're anxious so that you are like frozen, you're not going to have flow. But if you could be anxious the way Jeff described, but so concentrated on exercising your control. You don't have control, but you are exercising control. I need to do this, I need to do that. And so I see that as, I can see that in hindsight, that people look back and say, like, wow, and I just did all that and I don't know how it happened. And I would say that's flow.
For sure. Thank you, Judith. And Maritza, next to answer.
So I'm actually going to cheat a little bit here. And can you guys see this screen? Do you see the screen, Joya?
Yes, we see it.
Perfect.
All right. So this is the challenge versus skills graph portrayed just a little differently. This is going to come up in our future chapters, but I just wanted to throw it up real quick because anxiety and worry are literally on here. And this is a great visual to show you where flow falls in the line. If your anxiety is, so you could potentially find flow in some of these different states, but what it's saying is if you don't have the right balance, because remember the sweet spot lies along this path here, right? So if your challenge level is too high in comparison to your skill level, you're gonna just miss flow and get stuck instead in anxiety. So that's kind of, this is like flow theory. If you wanted to type it into Google and see what comes up, that's kind of what it's called. So this graph kind of is my answer to Jyoti's question from a very cheating perspective, because this is actually MC's words here. From a personal perspective, I think there's no room. I would say the answer would be no. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys experience this, but right before I give a presentation, I have like all these butterflies in my stomach. And, I'm super nervous. My palms are all sweaty. I'm looking and I know I'm prepared. I've done all the prep, the research. I've got my notes. I have my words, what I'm going to say. I've studied them and I'm super nervous. But then something magical happens when I get up on that stage and I start to speak. No more sweaty palms. No more butterflies. I don't even remember that I was like 2 seconds away from throwing up. The only thing there is what I've already prepared, making sure I'm looking out at people. And I'm not even thinking about looking out at people. I'm just naturally looking up. And that's maybe a slight oversimplification of it, but it doesn't have to be something like rock climb. Like somebody put in the chat that they're immersed when they're serving others. I can see it. If what brings you immense enjoyment is being in a soup kitchen and being able to provide for those who can't for themselves. I can totally see that you can be standing there on your feet for 3 hours, giving out meals and not even notice it. You'd be like, whoa, where did the time go? You know, your anxiety about the fact that you still have to go home and put in 5 hours of work, or you have to make sure your own kids have food, or none of that is going to be able to be in your mind because you've got, this is your focus. And it's almost effortless. So it's not that your anxiety magically disappears. It's just that all of your bandwidth is being used by this task. If it's a task that's got just the right components to put you in a flow state, the anxiety kind of has to take a backseat because you don't have enough bandwidth for it. And that's all I was going to say on that. Thank you.
I love that word, effortless. I think that's a great word to describe what it's like when you're in that flow state, when you are so immersed and so absorbed in what you're doing, whether it is serving others at the soup kitchen or rock climbing or reading, that you're having that experience of being totally absorbed, of having some kind of challenge, but of being totally immersed, and it just feels effortless. That's a beautiful way to describe it. Let's then turn to Jyoti, I think, wants to say one more thing in response to her own question.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking on those lines too, Marissa, when I asked that question, was I could not see anxiety and flow hand in hand. They couldn't possibly go, because when you have a flow, there's a wonderful feeling of relaxation with it. And if you have that kind of anxiety, then there's no room for the flow. Now I do the exercises and I try to make 10,000 every day and 10,000 steps. Then comes at 9 o'clock. So I have to make sure that before 9 o'clock hits, I have to do my 10,000. And keeping that in mind, the portion of anxiety in that case gets kind of takes a backseat. Sometimes it will start with anxiety. Will I be able to make it by 10,000 by 9 o'clock? But then once I get started with it, with my steps, that takes a back seat, and sometimes it disappears as I'm going through. And there's a perfect feeling of relaxation, but I'm very sleepy at 9 o'clock then because I'm totally relaxed in my head. But that's besides the point. So I think you have said it right, that you can't have anxiety when you are consumed and you are trying to forget everything around you, but you have this anxiety going with you. Then how you can feel that feeling that nothing around you matters to you. It does matter to you. Anxiety is there to matter to you. So okay, thank you. It makes sense.
Thank you, Jyoti. And now I'm going to be looking to see if Jyoti's going to start pacing back and forth at 9 p.m. during some of our meetings, if she hasn't yet gotten in all her steps for the day.
Well, you know what? I did finish my steps. Actually, I did 11. But every day I do 9 o'clock sessions. And by 10:30, I'm like just zooming out. I can process. And then suddenly I will say, okay, you know what, I'm enjoying it and all that is there, but it's not really going in. So I will write to Shrikant, I'm leaving now. So I can't go, and sometimes they go beyond 11:30. I can handle that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, thank you. No, I'm okay. Today I'm okay. It's 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock I can handle.
Perfect. Next, let's go to Judith's question, which was this question about the beginning and end of flow and how that flow state fits into the rest of our activities for the day. Anybody have any thoughts they'd like to share to answer Judith's question here? So if you have an answer, again, you can raise your hand, type exclamation point in the chat.
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry, I zoomed out a little bit.
Yeah. Why don't I even turn it over to Judith one more time just to make sure that we're really clear on exactly what her question is. Judith, did you want to repeat your question?
Well, I was just wondering how we define flow state in certain activities that we do. So he did talk about being lost in reading a book, or, you know, when you read a book and you just get so involved in it, but that's not, well, so that's a mental activity, but then I suppose then you could say that when you watch a movie, then you get lost in a movie, maybe? That would be a flow state too. So are we limited to states that we're a flow state where there is some kind of sense of like personal accomplishment, or it's just a passive activity like watching a movie, right? So does it have to be an active activity? How are we defining this flow state? What in those ways?
I'll jump in to start to say one of the ideas that we're going to get to next, and unfortunately, unlike Maritza, I don't have a cheat sheet with a graphic, but there is a graphic that we'll eventually come to, I believe, in all of our flow discussions that talks about the flow cycle. There's this idea of it starts with struggle, and then there's a moment of release, and then you're in flow, and then you essentially deplete all your energy and you go into you need a relaxation and recovery stage after it. And that's the flow cycle. But I think you're right that watching a movie can be a flow state. I think it has to do whether you're having this experience of absorption and immersion. So a movie, I think, would be an example where you're not likely to be anxious, I would hope, when watching a movie, but you might fall into apathy and boredom. And perhaps that's what happens to too many people. They're mindlessly putting on the TV and zoning out, and they're not really absorbed and immersed in the story that's going on. So I believe this is an example of when perhaps it might be a flow state, depending on your attitude, depending on how you're approaching watching the movie. I would imagine that movie critics, for example, or people who create films probably do very much get into flow states when they're watching films, because there's just so much to process and take in, and they've completely lost all sense of time and self as they're completely absorbed in what's happening with the film. But it probably does depend on the attitude you're bringing there. It looks like Jyoti also has something to say to this, then also Dave and Maritza.
Yeah, I think you said it already about what is the purpose of your seeing a movie. Is it an escape, or is it something that interests you, or it has some kind of passion for you? Then you can maintain flow. Then it automatically comes. But if you are just just changing the channels, maybe this one, maybe that one, then the flow doesn't come. So it depends on what you're like. I like the war movies, and I go on the Netflix and I search for the war movies. And once I start, if it's no, usually they are documentaries, or there are war movies too. They were filmed during the wartime, and there is a story behind it. And once I turn that on, I think I have a perfect flow. I'm just consumed in it. It's very relaxing to me, even if the movie is taking a negative turn. But I am into it. I'm consumed by it. So it depends on what kind of interest you have in a movie, or even in reading a book. I'm reading a very nice book. My daughter has forced me to read it. I'm reading it, and then I am like in it. And then suddenly I will break my reverie. I will say, no, you have some household work to do. Don't just keep reading this. You've got a lot of things to do today. And then I will shut it and the flow will go off. But then I see that I have a flow because I'm enjoying it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. And I see Kimberly here mentions that perhaps it even depends on who you are and what the movie is, that different people will have a different response based on the particular movie and whether or not they'll be absorbed by it or not. Next, so we have Dave to answer the question, and then Maritza.
Yeah, thanks, Joya. just a comment, as far as reading a book, to me, it's how involved you are in the book. I think use the expression zoning out. But if you're in the doctor's office and you're so absorbed in the book, you don't hear them call your name. Mr. Dittemore, Mr. It's your point. Oh, okay. But you're reading, you're not just reading the words, you're seeing yourself in the book. And as far as movie, I saw the biography of Anthony Bourdain Wednesday afternoon called Roadrunner. And I would say I don't see myself as Anthony Bourdain. I mean, he was the world traveler, had the world in his palm of his hands, got to travel over every place and have these meals with people. But the fact is, most of us know he committed suicide 2 years ago. So it was interesting to see his personal journey, what he'd gone through, and kind of inklings of what was to come. But I was very absorbed, and it just was such an interesting movie. It really had my attention. So that's kind of how I see Flow. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I definitely want to check out that movie, Roadrunner, you said it was called?
Correct.
Yeah, I'm going to go check that out. Maritza is up next.
So as somebody who in general, I'm like the worst TV watcher. I watch TV and do like 1,000,004 other things. And it doesn't matter how interesting the movie is. I can sleep through it. I'll fall asleep if I'm tired. It doesn't hold it just doesn't do it for me. A book, however, I can just forget, like, if I start reading a book, so I have a rule with myself. I'm not allowed to start reading a book in the evenings ever. That's been my rule really since I started my first like real job in my early 20s, because I forget to eat. I forget to go to the bathroom. I forget to sleep. And then I finish the book and I've got the satisfaction of the last page. And then I look up and I'm like, oh crap, it's 6:30 a.m. I gotta go to work. But wait. So I would say now in hindsight, because, way too young and dumb to know back then, but in hindsight, I would think that I was probably in some type of a flow state. But actually, I don't know who uses, I think your T uses the word escape. And I'm curious as to, and I'm gonna pose this as a question, and it doesn't need to be answered today. We may get to this in the future chapters. How do we distinguish between something that's an escape and something that's adding us onto this path of flow? Because it could be argued that, everything fell away and my entire focus was on reading this book. But that was only because I was escaping the realities, the unpleasant realities of life, right? So I'm cheating, Joya, and I'm answering this question with another question. How do we distinguish between, a true flow state and an escape mechanism?
Well, I love your question. And I will just point out that coming up, let me just double check what week this is. So in chapter 7, which is all about work as flow, we talk about, there's a whole section there about the waste of free time is what it's called. And I think that will be where we will start to explore this question of escapism and free time. And is it a bad thing? What's its connection to flow? So
awesome.
We got to wait several weeks though.
Okay, really quickly, Joya, if I can just throw in 2 seconds. Judith specifically talked about begin and end. And I would just want to say here that maybe the second we realize that other things are encroaching, that would be the end. And the beginning, I feel like the beginning to me is a little bit harder to pinpoint, because I would imagine that you can only identify the beginning after you've identified the end, because you're slipping from being in a place where all these, day-to-day little small things they're there, and then suddenly they're not, but you're not aware that they're not, because you you don't have the bandwidth even for realizing that you're in the flow state. You only realize it when you're done. Does that, I don't know, does that make sense? Or is that the way you view it, Joya?
I think that's right. That's the principle we talked about today, the loss of self-consciousness. So when you're not aware of yourself, part of what you're losing is that consciousness of, oh, I think I'm in a flow state. I think even that would knock you out of the flow state. You'd have to get back into the flow state if that happened to you. Let's move through with the questions though, because we do have to cut this off in just about 11 minutes here, so we can all move to the next meetup group if you're interested in doing Ascent of Man. So I see Michael did reframe his question, which was all about reframing. So I'll read this here. He says, if we offer our concentration to those tasks and activities which we regard as important, given this is a flow characteristic, how might we assign some potentials to those tasks and activities which we regard as mundane or trivial that would entice our engagement? Perhaps to cause transformations of any size and kind, allowing for flow to occur in the process as well. And I do believe this is a question about reframing. I love the way that Maritza reframes the question to be all about reframing. That's what I see here as well, that when we have a situation that just seems to be trivial and we want to turn that situation into a flow situation, is there something that we can do to get into flow? So let's see, it looks like Judith has something to say, and then Jack.
Yeah, I think it's attitude. You know, when I talked about my taxes, I don't want you to think I like doing them. It's just that when I drop the resistance, you know, I change my attitude. And then I'm like, okay, it's a big job. I'm gonna have to do it. So like, let's just not fight about it. And then I let go. I really let go I finally jump into it. A lot of procrastination, but when I finally do it. So I think that's the kind of thing that you have to take to any of those mundane things, your dishes or whatever, is just decide, well, you know, you could do it or not do it. And so if you decide you're going to do it, you might as well do it all in.
I like that phrase of describing it as going all in. Did you want to share anything more about how you're maybe able to overcome the resistance?
No, I'm not good at that. So
Okay.
so I wish I could be, but I know that ultimately that's it. But that when I do that with other things too, then I actually can get into a state where then like gardening is another thing. And then every time I go out there and pull all those weeds out, I'm like, why don't I do this all the time? I actually enjoy this after I'm done, right? But I will never want to go out there. So so it's just some things there's a resistance. And so, but if you can drop it away and not like carry that with you as you're doing it, because like just accept, well, if you're going to do it, like I said, just go all in, then I think you'll be most likely to maybe let that flow come. And if it would, you know, but if you're going to do it and have this conversation in your head about how you hate it, you're never going to get flow that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next up, we have Jack, Dave, Jyoti, and I see Felicia raising her hand, but I think that's where we're going to cut it off too, so that we can get to Ascent of Man. So next up is Jack.
So on page 51, he says, one purpose of this book is to explore ways in which even routine details can be transformed into personal, meaningful games that provide optimal experience. Mowing the lawn or waiting in the dentist's office can become enjoyable, provided one restructures the activity by providing goals, rules, and other elements of enjoyment to be reviewed. And then he goes on and talks about the example of the, what was mentioned earlier about the man in the listening to a conference and going, having the tapping game. And so I think what he's saying, goals, rules, and other elements, if you do that to even the most mundane activities, you can get into a state of flow through those practices.
Wonderful. That's a perfect quote. Thank you for reminding us of that one. That's perfect. Next up, we have Dave, Jyoti, and we're ending with Felicia.
Yeah, thanks. It seems to me the key is attention, and I would say pay attention to details. One thing I enjoy doing is cooking, And a lot of times I'm paying attention about when to turn over the hash browns and stirring things around and such. And I lose track of what's going on in the TV set in the next room. So I would say try paying attention to details. Try that.
That's a great suggestion. And it even ties us perfectly with what we discussed last week with this idea of focus and attention. That's perfect. GOT next.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to remind you guys that last week we talked about this, and I had said that I don't like the dishes. I don't like washing the dishes. I don't mind cooking. I don't mind setting the table, but I don't like washing the dishes. So what makes me do the dishes is that I set up like a reward for myself. What I like to see, the reward is that I want to see my kitchen look tidy. I can't stand the clutter and some little crumbs here and there and all that. So I always tell myself, I said, do the dishes because you're going to like the kitchen afterwards. And that makes me do it like, what Judith said, without any resentment. And I enjoy doing it then. But that's my area that I have to, every day I have to talk myself out of it.
Thank you for sharing, Jyoti.
Sure.
And lastly, we have Felicia.
So for me, I have found success in pairing something I'm not openly initially keen on doing with something else either that I prefer or I don't like to do. So I'm at least killing two birds with one stone. To be candid, nothing particular to this group. I'm not a huge fan of Zoom calls. I'm not a fan of having to sit in front of a video for X amount of time engaging in this conversation. I like to do multiple things. So I went for a walk. I had a chance to walk while participating in this group. It forced me to be 100% immersed and really open up to what you guys were sharing and the possibility this is something I would want to do again. At the same time, getting my fitness done for the day. And that has worked for me in other areas. I don't know everyone's name yet. I'm not a fan of cleaning the kitchen either. I'm notorious for going in there to clean 3 dishes and magically I'm back upstairs watching Netflix. So I've learned to take my laptop downstairs and put on top of the refrigerator and then have my docuseries of choice running to ensure I clean the entire kitchen. And that has worked for me to start doing something that I don't really like. Then over time, like she said, I like having my kitchen cleaned. I don't need to bring the laptop down. I'm into the flow of cleaning my kitchen. I'm into the flow of coming here 2 times a month and enjoying the conversations. Over.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Felicia, and welcome. We're really glad to have you with us. I'll share too. The Zoom burnout is definitely real. When Shrikant first started all these meetups, they were in person in New York City, and I'm hoping we're able to get back to some of that soon. But I have to say, the amazing thing is getting to meet all the rest of you and having us be able to participate like this from anywhere, really, around the world. And I love your suggestion too, Felicia, of being able to combine the Zoom meeting with something else like walking that then just makes it much more of a physical activity. So you're not just sitting in front of the computer screen. That's probably something that I think we can all perhaps challenge ourselves to find what is the ways that we can add to the experiences we have to go through, whether it is Zoom, because that has become so much a part of daily life now for many people, but how can we add more physical activity and more enjoyment to our everyday activities? So I now am going to put in the chat the Zoom link for the next meetup. It is a different Zoom link, and then I'm going to turn it over to Maritza to close us out here for tonight.
I just would like to point out to you guys that there was a running theme for all of our questions here and really for just about all of your answers. And it's this concept of taking control. So there are tasks that need done, and we can either do them begrudgingly or manage to find a way in which to wield them where they feel less burdensome and more, and we'll reuse the word since Joy, I liked it, and more effortless. And I would just like to point out that I suspect we will learn together as we move forward more that that's exactly the key. the key is this reframing of things in a way that they are most beneficial to yourself and can help get you on that meaningful path to better experiences and a more satisfying and fulfilling end result, as it were. Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you. So we'll see you all again here for Flow in 2 weeks at the same time. And next we've got Ascent of Man.
Yep.
See you
Take
next
care,
time,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Great program. Thank you.
Thank you.